Oh, oh. Welcome, welcome everyone to Friday, to Sleepy Friday. Today is the start of the weekend, but at the same time, it is also the end of what we started a few days ago, which is looking at what changed in the specs from one patch to the next, from 9.1.5 to 9.2, in the choices, in the options that the specs had in their legendaries. Before, of course, the option was only one legendary, now it's two. And then, of course, as a result of this, also what changed in their covenants. Because perhaps before a spec was Night Fae, but they weren't really interested in the Night Fae legendary because they were playing a different one. Now that they have to, if they want to use two legendaries, now that they have to play with a Covenant legendary, perhaps it's much better for them to go Kyrian. So they all swapped from Night Fae to Kyrian. Same goes for the options of the other non-Covenant legendary. Perhaps the combination with the Covenant legendary makes a different one better. So we have looked up to now, we have looked at the tanks, we have looked at the healers, and we have looked at the melee DPS. So the only one that's left at this point is the Ranged DPS category. Much like the melee DPS of a couple of days ago, it's the same. They have more changes. They are a little bit more diverse than the tanks and healers, particularly than the tanks. So there is a little bit more to go over. Let's start first point of order with the covenants, because that might also indicate which of these specs are also changing legendary. If they are changing covenant, it is likely, not for all of them, but it is likely that they are changing the covenant because the covenant legendary is better. We pointed out before with the question, I left you with the question if we would have been able to tear down the purple wall of the Ranged DPS. This unmovable object that has remained as the mainstay pick for the majority of the ranged specs of Night Fae. This purple wall of Night Fae that was predominant, particularly in Mythic Plus. What is this? 8, I think. 8 out of 11 specs in Mythic Plus were picking Night Fae for all ranged. So let's take a look and see just how much this predominance of Night Fae has changed. We are starting with taking a look at absolutely nothing, because we are looking at Affliction Warlock. Affliction Warlock went from 98% to 99% and from 94% to 93% between last patch and this patch. So pretty much nothing really changed for Affliction Warlock when it comes to their options in their covenants. Just to stay on the boring side, we can follow it up with Arcane, because Arcane has also remained still Kyrian. As a matter of fact, there hasn't really been any change as far as picks for Arcane Mage either. Then we go to our first change. Perhaps it's not what you wanted to see, because it's Balanced Druid. Balanced Druid, at the start of the expansion, for a long while, they were Night Fae, and then they moved over to Ventir after their Night Fae combo was nerfed, and then Ventir was also nerfed. So some Balanced Druids were thinking about going back to Night Fae, but perhaps that was temporary, just in time to get their double legendary and go back to Ventir. What is the result after all of this? The result is that now there is a more clear split, although it's still quite even between the two. Because in Mythic Plus, it's 60-40 split in favor of Night Fae, while in Raiding, it's 70-30 in favor of Ventir. So there is a pretty healthy divide between two viable covenants for Balanced Druid, which is certainly better than having one. It just makes up for more variety, especially because it also changes their cooldown windows, changes their burst, how they want to do it. So it's a pretty good change. Although it's yet one more Night Fae spec becoming prevalent, so the wall of purple becomes stronger at the moment compared to last patch. Has the wall of purple gotten torn down for the other specs like Beast Mastery, Demonology, Destruction? Those three specs before they had the 90-ish, 80 to 90% range of Night Fae picks, regardless of activity. Mythic Plus or Raiding, about 9 out of 10 of these specs were playing Night Fae. It's been over a month, we have gotten a bunch more borrowed powers. Has anything changed? No. No. Beast Mastery, Demonology, and Destruction are still predominantly Night Fae. They haven't really gone to explore other picks. The only one that is a little bit more brave is Destruction. A little bit in Mythic Plus. And we will look at this later on with the Legendaries. But it is still in the 20% range. You know, it's not that significant. So the Wall of Purple resists for Red Encounters and for Mythic Plus so far for the Ranged DPS. We continue our Wall of Purple down with Elemental, Fire Mage, and Frost Mage. These were the other three Wall of Purples. These were the other three specs completing the purple wall of Night Fae for Ranged DPS. Elemental Shaman was a little bit more split between Night Fae and Necrolord in their choices last patch. It was in the 60-ish% range for Night Fae in Mythic Plus. Well, now it's 90%. Also, before it was roughly 50% Necrolord in Red Encounters, while now it's 80% and more Night Fae in Red Encounters. So, Night Fae predominance gets even stronger in 9.2, with Elemental almost fully switching to Night Fae. This is of course due to what we will see soon, Legendary, and the synergy with the tier set bonus of Elemental. What about Fire? We have been seeing Fire for a long time being Night Fae, because the Covenant ability fit very well with the theme of Fire Mage being a very heavily reliant spec on cooldowns. So having a Covenant ability that reduces your cooldowns, well, sure, I'll go with that. 100% of Fire Mages were Night Fae in Mythic Plus, and a little bit over 80% of Fire Mages were Night Fae in Red Encounters. So now, in this patch, we do see 99% of Fire Mages being Night Fae in Mythic Plus. So yeah, the same. But we have a change. We have a tiny, very tiny little crack in the purple wall, because Night Fae Fire Mage goes from 80% to 40% in Red Encounters, while Ventir rises up significantly to almost 60%. So this is the first betrayal of Night Fae that we see in Ranged DPS after the half and half betrayal of Balanced Druid, which was already sort of in between the two choices. This one is a full-on complete betrayal of a Fire Mage who goes Ventir in Red Encounters a little bit more at the moment. The last of the specs talking about the Night Fae dominance was Frost Mage. Frost Mage wasn't really one of the mainstay picks of Night Fae before. They had still their main pick of Ventir in Red Encounters. It was Mythic Plus that had a little bit more of a Night Fae predominance for Frost. 64% of Frost Mages were Night Fae last patch in Mythic Plus. Now it's 66% of Frost Mages, so really more or less unchanged. The main change, however, isn't in the majority of the pick, it's in the minority. As you can see, we have a near complete split. Before, 1/3 of Frost Mages were Ventir, and none of them were Necro. Now, none of them are Ventir, and 1/3 of them are Necro. This is continued in the change in Red Encounters, which is also going to be our biggest change of the day. Frost Mages were almost 90% Ventir in last patch in Raid. Now they are over 90%, in fact almost all of them are Necrolord. So we have a massive swing from 87% to 96%, and almost 190% swing between the two. That is quite significant, and of course we will check it out in the Legendary picks as to why this is happening. Last two picks, not too much to talk about because it's Marksmanship and Shadow Priest. Marksmanship was split, similar to other specs. They were split between two Covenants, Kyrian and Night Fae. They were more even, they are the most even of the specs when it comes to choosing Kyrian or Night Fae in last patch. This patch, we have gotten a little bit more of a stretching to the sides, to the edges, because in Mythic Plus there are more Marksmanship Hunters picking Kyrian, while in Red Encounters there are more Marksmanship Hunters picking Night Fae. This is the more clear divide now between the two choices of Marksmanship. Meanwhile, there has been little to no divide in the choices of Shadow Priest. Shadow Priest was Necrolord before, is continuing to be Necrolord. The only other niche option for Shadow Priest was Night Fae, which is still present, although much less than before. So this is the overall balance changes of Ranged DPS when it comes to Covenant options. What about their changes then? So from last patch to this patch, we have 11 different Ranged DPS specs. They can pick a Covenant in Mythic Plus, they can pick a Covenant in Raid. So out of 22 possible options, how many of them have changed between last patch and this? Well, we have about 4 significant changes in the Ranged DPS camp. We see Balanced Druid now being more evenly split between Night Fae and Ventir. We also see Elemental Shaman going more fully towards Night Fae instead of splitting time with Necro. We see the Frost Mages going from Ventir to Necrolord, particularly in the raid, and Fire Mage also splitting their time way more into Ventir in raids. So those are the 4 main changes. We also have some growth or loss of participation in certain other covenants, like the split of covenants for marksmanship. There are more options, more niche options in things like Ventir, Mythic Plus for Destro, and some other niche things, but overall we are in the 20-ish% range of changes for covenants for the Ranged DPS, which is still more than tanks and healers overall, but not as much as melee. They are not gonna beat, spoiler, they're not gonna beat the changes that melee DPS specs are going through in 9.2 when it comes to covenants. So what about now their changes in legendaries? We have gotten some changes in covenants, so obviously we are bound to see some changes in options of legendary picks for these specs. First in line is Demonology. Demonology is not changing too much their legendaries for raid because they are still playing with Wilfred's Sigil, and now they are just pairing it together with the Soul Satchel of Night Fae, so this is just the same. The main change is for Mythic Plus of Demonology Warlock, because in Mythic Plus they have way more of a representation of implosive potential compared to before. This is even some more Dreadstalkers, even more Grim Inquisitors, Dread Calling Legendary is more represented than before. So both of these two options are being quite represented as the options for Demonology Warlock, unlike before. Not that before we had too much of a pool of options to look at a demo, because demo wasn't that popular in Mythic Plus. Now that they are actually one of the more popular, they have quite a few choices in Mythic Plus to go for. Quite a cool state of variety for demo when it comes to legendary options. That's our first significant, decent, good change of variety for legendaries. Where we also see another significant change is in Frost Mage. So in Mythic Plus, as we said, more and more Frost Mages are going Night Fae, so of course they are using the Night Fae Covenant Legendary, which is also more useful for them than it is for Fire Mage, because of their consistent damage. Gaining some free extra crit and haste for 15 seconds is gonna play out better for Frost Mage, but also it's not too different. The Freezing Winds that they were using before, together now there is also the Disciplinary Command for burst damage for Frost Mage, which they don't have too much. They are basically tied to Frozen Orb, which is more or less up every single time in Mythic Plus. So Disciplinary Command gives them more burst damage, together with the Night Fae Legendary, also more burst damage as well. But the bigger change isn't this Disciplinary Command pick in Mythic Plus. The bigger change is the raid. As we said, Frost Mage is moving more and more towards Necro. So first of all, they are moving also away from Freezing Winds, this super powerful legendary that accompanied Frost Mage for what it seems like forever. Instead, now they are going back to Slick Ice. This is the more Frostbolt spammy type of legendary. It just, makes you do more damage with Frostbolt inside of Icy Veins. We have already looked into the Icy Veins uptime of Frost Mage. It is very, very high. They can almost run the entire raid fight with Icy Veins active, so this buff is massive for spamming Frostbolt, and Deathborn as a Covenant ability is quite powerful in this effect. The cooldown in and of itself is okay, I guess. What makes this a little bit better is Death's Fathom Covenant Legendary. This is the Necrolord Covenant Legendary, which makes your Frostbolt spam have a chance to grant Deathborn for 8 seconds. And while in the form of Deathborn, both this proc and the normal cooldown, you gain increased spell damage for every Frostbolt you cast. So this one, with Slick Eyes being a build centered around being a Frostbolt machine gun, this Covenant works very well for Frostmage when it comes to raid encounters. Of course, in Mythic Plus, it's terrible because you're not going to be spamming Frostbolts, so this is not really quite valuable in Mythic Plus, but in raid encounters for pure turret single target damage, it's quite powerful, which is also why when you look at the raid, we have seen Frostmage being quite high in single target, which wasn't something they were too good at last year. So that is quite interesting. Unfortunately, this is just about most of the interesting stuff we will see when it comes to legendaries for Ranged DPS, because we move over to marksmanship, and marksmanship is still, as we said, split between Kyrian and Night Fae. So of course there are two legendaries, Covenant legendaries, Pact of the Soul Stalkers, and the no, I'm not gonna look. I know this. Fragments of the Elder Antler. Fragments of the Elder Antlers. Yeah, okay. Fragments of the Elder Antlers. The two legendaries are still their choices depending on raid encounters or Mythic Plus, and their legendaries are also the same. I guess they are different since we're looking all the way back to 9.1.5. Surging Shots is still a pick of choice. We can say that their older main pick of legendary. Their Aim Shot legendary, Serpent Stalker's Trickery, is now being significantly less used. In fact, it's not being used at all. Why? Because thanks to their tier set, this legendary has been made essentially obsolete, even in single target, by Secrets of the Unblinking Vigil. We have talked about this before. The set bonus of Marksmanship Hunters work very well with this legendary, because this legendary gives you chances to not consume any focus, to give you back a charge of Aim Shot, and then you have the 2-piece and the 4-piece set bonus of Marksmanship Hunter working with Aim Shot, particularly the effect that gives you damage increase, or rather the ability to proc trick shots in single target, thanks to the tier set, makes this very, very powerful. So that's their main pick of choice. Another possible change goes to Shadow Priest, but again, it's not massive like the first two specs we looked at. Shadow Priests are going back a little bit more to Talbadar's Stratagem, which was a legendary they used before Shadow Flame Prism was buffed a little bit more, and then nerfed, and then buffed, and then nerfed, etc, etc. So that's gotten into their pool of options in legendaries, both in single target, raid encounters, and Mythic Plus. Not much to say about Covenant options because they are still just using Palette Command of Necrolord without too many other options for them. We also do see the little change of Balanced Druid. Balanced Druid was playing before with Sinful Hysteria as a Ventir. If they were playing Night Fae long ago, they were playing with a very nerfed legendary. So now that they are going back to playing with Night Fae a little bit more, they still have, of course, the Covenant legendary Celestial Spirits and Primordial Arcanic Pulsar. This is the new mainstream main pick legendary for Balanced Druid. I guess it's quite handy for them that this is the same legendary, whether they are Night Fae, whether they are Ventir, single target, AoE, Mythic Plus, raids, doesn't matter. PAP, this legendary is still the main pick for Balanced Druids, together with either the Ventir or the Night Fae Covenant legendary. Destruction Warlocks are still going for Wilfred Sigil. Much like Demo, they are still a quite, Tyrant / Infernal centric build for their burst damage. So Wilfred Sigil and their Covenant legendary Soul Satchel, Decaying Soul Satchel, are still the main couple of their picks. They are, however, having a little bit of a surprising growth in two different scenarios. One are the raids, where more and more Warlocks are picking up Madness of the Ajakir. This is something I said, if you are a long-time viewer, I said this in the beta, that if this legendary was going to be viable, it would have been far into the patch, far into the expansion, several item levels and borrowed powers deep into the expansion, simply because of the haste and casts needed to make this continuous damage increase work, which was definitely not possible early in the expansion. Now there are a few more Warlocks going for this, just like there are a few more Destrolocks going for something else in Mythic Plus, which is the Ventir niche pick. Some Warlocks are trying out Contained Perpetual Explosion, being of course Ventir, that's what they have to pick. Or even more AoE damage, just what Destrolocks needed. More AoE damage in Gigapools in Mythic Plus. I guess that's why they're going for this. Fire Mage goes back to, reverts to something they were doing before, because in Red Encounters they are still going for their new legendary that became the better one in the last patch, which was Sun King's Blessing. So they are pairing together with the Ventir Covenant legendary or the Night Fae Covenant legendary, depending on what they are as. In Mythic Plus there is the change. In Mythic Plus they are still back using Disciplinary Command as a pick, even more than Sun King's Blessing. This perhaps might have to do with the Relic, right? Being Night Fae, getting in Mythic Plus as Night Fae for the cooldown reduction, plus the Relic cooldown reduction in Mythic Plus, not to mention that quite a few mages still run Kindling in Mythic Plus, which is even more combustion reduction of cooldown, makes combustion active extremely often, which gives you less value to Sun King's Blessing, less value to getting a mini combustion. So instead you would much rather like the extra burst of Disciplinary Command, the 20% more crit damage that you can get inside combustion because of this. So that's likely the change given by the Relic. By this point we have looked at quite a few specs having a certain change being pushed by the Relic, being pushed by the faster cooldowns that the Relic can give you. And that's quite obvious by this point how many specs are benefiting from this change, from this new affix. Little to no change on the other hand for Elemental Shaman. Elemental Shaman, once we acknowledge that they are now almost completely moving over to Night Fae, regardless of the situation, more or less. In Mythic Plus, they are, to no surprise, using Echoes of Great Sundering, together with their Seeds of Rampant Growth legendary. If they go to Red Encounters, then it's just the Wind Speaker's Lava Resurgence legendary for single target. There is basically no other change, pretty much, for Elemental Shaman. Little to no change also for Arcane Mage. Arcane Mage is just Tyrian all the time and is playing with Arcane Harmony all the time. That's it. That's the news from one patch to the next. Arcane Mage is not really changing. Definitely the least changed of Mage specs this patch. Quite disappointing. Honestly, Beast Mastery Hunter. Beast Mastery Hunter is also not changing too much. Beast Mastery Hunter was looking at Relic Stalker's Piercing Fangs last patch as a very good legendary. Still, the majority of hunters were still using Fragments of the Elder Antlers, because they could only use one. Now they can use two together, so what a surprise, they are using both of them at the same time. That's pretty much the solution, the very difficult solution that BM has to reach. Just put them together. Forehead. No changes as well between Mythic Plus and Red Encounters. Since this legendary is quite useful in all scenarios, you don't need to swap depending on the activity you're doing as a BM hunter. Lastly, we can close with Affliction Warlock. Affliction Warlock, much like the rest of the Warlocks, is still quite fond of Wilfred's Sigil, is still quite fond of getting their Dark Glare back off cooldown faster. No surprise, obviously, that they are also playing with the Decaying Soul Satchel, since they are all Night Fae. That's what they have to play with. Surprising possible changes of picks of Affliction, but there is such few representation at the moment for Affliction in Red Encounters that it's kind of difficult to even gauge if there has been a significant change. It's more visible in Mythic Plus. Yes, in Mythic Plus it's more visible because we do see more Warlocks, for example, picking up Wrath of Consumption as a legendary in Mythic Plus. Meanwhile, we could be looking instead at the complete opposite. For example, Malefic Wrath, which was one of their higher considered legendaries last patch, has dropped significantly compared to what they used to have before. So Affliction has gotten a change, primarily when you're looking at Mythic Plus, not as much when you're looking at the raid encounters. So, you know, all in all, when the Covenant changes are not that many for Ranged DPS, we definitely do have more of a twist, more of a switch around when it comes to legendary options. It's still more than the tank and healers, but not by much compared to the more variety, the more heavy amount of changes that we have seen for the melee DPS so far. Now, after looking through all of them, it's also worth mentioning that you don't necessarily need to change your Covenant, ability or your other legendary to completely change the spec. You know, perhaps it is perfectly possible that the 98% of last patch's Kyrian Arcane Mages going 99% of this patch Kyrian Arcane Mages using Arcane Harmony last patch and using Arcane Harmony Legendary this patch, basically zero change in Arcane Mage. It is still possible that they could change more in their rotation, in their playstyle, because of more item level, more stats, different trinkets, 2-piece set bonus, 4-piece set bonus, compared to another spec that perhaps has gotten a complete overhaul. Not having changed in Covenant or in legendary picks doesn't necessarily mean that your spec is as boring or as disappointing, whatever have you, as last patch. Perhaps it's more complete. Perhaps it's more refreshing to play, mostly because of the tier set bonuses that you're gonna get. With that being said, this was the entire recap of the changes of Covenant and legendary options for all of the specs. And now that we are done with the ranged, so for the start of this weekend, we can stop here. Guys, thank you, of course, for watching the video, for helping to grow the channel, and you can, of course, contribute even more with liking and commenting on the video, as well as subscribing to the channel. But obviously, I have gotten a letter from my lawyers for today. The subscription button has been kept open to all of the players who have been meddling with Ranged DPS characters recently, at the very least. So you can, of course, as usual, follow me on Twitter, just in case you might see one of my tweets. Not too sure, honestly. And then, of course, you can support me on Patreon, but mostly just so I can buy myself some heating system for my room, so I don't have to dress up like it's winter every day. Thank you, guys. Thank you, guys, for watching. See you guys soon. And in the meantime, I don't know. Even if I had a heater system, I like the cold more than I like the heat, honestly. I'm fine with this, though.